Let's get started. Welcome to Quick Bites, everybody. This is the Food Foundation's channel for talking about issues that have happened in the news around food policy. And I'm really, really thrilled that we have Sandra and Indra here today from the Climate Change Committee. And hopefully everyone will have caught in the news that they published the 7th carbon budget last week. And this is a chance for us to delve into what its implications are for food, diet, agriculture, and all things in the kind of food space. And we've got the perfect people with us today to talk about that because they did all the work for the report. So thank you, Sandra and Indra. We're going to jump straight in just to orient the conversation a little bit into could you just give us the sort of top basics on what is the 7th carbon budget? How does it fit into net zero? And why these reports are just so important?
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, so let me just start by sort of setting out what the Climate Change Committee is. So we're the UK's independent advisor on both tackling climate change, but also preparing an adaptation in the face of climate change. So an independent body, statutory body established under the Climate Act 2008. And one of the key things, one of our statutory duties is to advise on the setting of these 5-yearly carbon budgets. So since 2019, we have a legislated target to reduce emissions to net zero by 2050. So what we do every 5 years is to give our advice to government on these series of five-yearly carbon budgets. So the advice that came out last year covers the period 2038 to 2043. So this is the 7th carbon budget. And within this work, we sort of update all our analysis on the reductions, emissions potential across all the different sectors in the UK economy.
Yeah, and if you imagine that we've got like a path down in terms of the amount of emissions to net zero, that's our kind of big model, but underneath those are sectoral models. So we basically assess what needs to happen for transport, what needs to happen for buildings, and amongst that is what needs to happen for agriculture and land use, which is why we're here to talk about today. And then as a sort of extension of what we've done previously for the 7th carbon budget, we've also looked at the importance of households and what we require households to do. So we've got quite a bit of analysis of what the choices are that households that we need households to take, and what the impacts will be on households of different characteristics.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's super. Now, you've obviously, in previous carbon budgets, you've talked about food and agriculture. What's different? Like, what's new in this one? Have you had to revise your projections or make different sorts of recommendations?
I mean, what we try to do every 5 years when we look at setting the advice of our carbon budget is to review the evidence since the last one came out. So since our 6th one came out in 2020, we look at, for example, in terms of reducing emissions from livestock and soils, what additional farming practices or measures have there been since 2020, where we've got better evidence on the abatement potential to reduce emissions in agriculture, for example. And likewise, I guess, on the dietary side.
So one of the things that you will see when we talk about our targets is we slightly push back the first target, but just because there hasn't really been any policy development in that space in the last 5 years. So we thought, there will be required to be some time to design and then implement policies.
Right. Okay. So from reading the chapter, so what I got from what I thought was interesting, and it might be helpful just to explain to people, is that when your sort of baseline in terms of emissions was that this sector, so agriculture, was contributing, I think, 7% of just UK emissions. That's important to kind of make clear to everybody. You're just looking at UK emissions. It's now 11%. So in other words, the share has been growing. Your projections through the balanced pathway is that this sector reduces its emissions by 39% by 2040. And at that point, it will be the second highest emitting sector emitting more than a quarter of our emissions. So just explain that to people, because it's not completely intuitive as to why that would be the case.
Yeah, so the 7% of UK emission relates back to 1990. And you can see since 1990, other sectors of the common economy have actually been able to reduce their emissions faster than agriculture. So the generation of electricity is a classic example. As we've shifted away from coal-fired power generation to more renewables, we've seen a large drop in emissions coming from that particular sector. But meanwhile, agriculture did see an initial drop in emissions at the start of that period from 1990, but it's been broadly static in the last 10 to 12 years. So it's a combination of both other sectors doing more, but also agriculture not really, seeing that decrease in emissions over time, which has contributed to that, that 7% rising to 11% based on the latest data. So we see going out to 2050, there are opportunities for agriculture to reduce emissions, but it's unlike transport or unlike electricity generation, we'll never be able to totally decarbonize the agricultural sector, because the biological processes involved in livestock and soil production means you can't reduce those emissions to zero. But there are a bunch of things that we can do to bring those emissions down, but there'll always be a residual level of emissions in agriculture.
And you talk in the report about upping the land use
Yes,
essentially, don't you?
Yes.
And
So
offsetting some of those.
Yeah, there's a few things that we look at in terms of reducing agricultural emissions. First is, well, what can farmers do to change the way they farm to reduce emissions? So it's things like, we look at things like feed additives that can be given to cattle and sheep to reduce the methane that's produced in their stomachs. That's one example. Decarbonising fossil fuel use in machinery, so moving away from the use of red diesel to electrification is another sort of opportunity. And then thirdly, diversification of the agricultural system. So, farmers freeing up some amount of land in order to plant trees or restore peat, and making sure that there's incentives in place for farmers to both do agriculture on the land that they still farm, but also being given an income to do other things with their land as well. So freeing up that land also enables more sequestration, more carbon being absorbed into the trees and into the soils to offset. So where we get to by 2050 is that the residual level of emissions in agriculture is totally offset by that increased land use sink.
Right, yeah. And so maybe you could just talk us through the kind of balance. Where you've talked then about some of the methods of rearing animals, for example, which can change, and the ways in which we actually farm. But also in your statistics, you've got, I think, 2/3 of current emissions from this sector come from livestock, half from enteric fermentation, i.e. from sheep and cows, essentially. So part of this story is the dietary shift alongside those changes in agricultural farming methods, if you like. What's the kind of relative balance of those two?
So in terms of I can't remember the actual percentage share, but when we looked at the reduction coming from those farming measures, so things like improving livestock health, changes in livestock feed, for example, decarbonising machinery, that gets us a certain level of reduction in emissions under no land use change from agriculture. Mm-hmm. But we see that when we factor in additional measures such as diet change and supply side measures to help farmers move their land out of agriculture, we get a much bigger emissions reduction. So what I'm saying is that just relying on technology and practices on farm alone won't deliver us the reductions we need in agriculture, and nor will it free up the land needed to grow our trees and restore our peat and also grow energy crops, for example.
I think it's just to be very clear that when we talk about dietary changes, really the end goal is a reduction in livestock numbers, and that is because that reduces emissions directly from livestock numbers from livestock, but then also frees up land that we can plant trees on to suck some of that carbon out of the atmosphere. So it's got this double effect. A little bit of that you see in 2040 of that sink, but it becomes more important in the later years, and then beyond 2050 when the trees have really grown. And then just to add to that, the change, the reduction in livestock numbers is achieved through a combination of demand, so reducing the demand for meat by people eating less meat and dairy, but then also some measures that help, so policies that help farmers diversify. So it can't be one or the other. So it needs to be a combination of the two, and not the very least, because if you support farmers to diversify, but you don't then support the public to reduce their meat and dairy consumption, all we would do is we would import more meat that might even be higher in emissions from elsewhere, and that's something we definitely want to avoid.
So this is a really important point. I think it's sort of at the heart of dietary shift is I mean, sort of really our raison d'etre as an organisation to a degree is to point out the kind of really critical role that food environments play in shaping those dietary choices, and that even in the face of good knowledge and understanding by the public on whether it's the health credentials of different foods or the environmental credentials of those foods, if the environments in which they're making decisions about what to eat inhibit those choices for whatever reason, and there are a multitude, you don't end up with those dietary shifts that you need to see. And this is the thing that I'm thinking here, if we're kind of reducing livestock numbers and supporting farmers with their livelihoods to make that transition, we have to make sure that essentially either the food environments change so dramatically, and here we're talking about price, availability of those foods, how they're marketed, the kind of big chunks of sort of ways in which those food environments shape our diets. Those food environments have to quite significantly change. So it's probably going to be price that would be the main lever, or there may be others. There are certainly other things that government can do in this space to promote plant-based alternatives, which you talk a little bit about in the report. But in the absence of having something on the trade side, which is actually preventing, as you say, imports produced with a higher climate impact than the meat that we're producing here, we're not going to see the shifts that we need. And what are the, I mean, obviously there's standards which can be built into trade deals. You talk a little bit about carbon border adjustments in the report. Can you just explain what that is? Because that's, everybody might not be familiar with what that exactly is.
Yeah, I think it's basically it's something that takes account of the carbon intensity of an imported product, of a product coming into this country. So I guess, I mean, we don't sort of set out what that means specifically in the report.
No.
It's almost like, I guess, like a mechanism that sort of takes account of the carbon intensity of individual products, and then maybe imposes a sort of import tariff to reflect that, really.
Right. And hasn't yet been implemented in any other sectors as an idea? Has it? I'm asking. You're aware of? No. Okay. I mean, it's just really interesting because I think we're in the context, obviously, of a lot of trade deals being kind of talked about at the moment, and a concern, I think, over the last few years that we've gone into trade deals pretty quickly without concern for making sure that the standards that we uphold here in the farming sector are applied to those imports. I know that's an area that the farmers in particular have been very concerned about. So it's obviously something that I think the pathway needs to keep kind of really strongly in focus in order to be able to deliver those reductions that which you're pointing to. But maybe you could also talk a little bit about the plant-based alternatives and how you see that developing in the pathway?
Yeah, so I think it's probably important background that in our pathway, what we assume, and this is something again that will be heavily influenced by policy choices, but we sort of looked at the different levers that are available to government, because we advise government we need to be confident that if we say, and we require a 35% reduction in meat consumption by 2050, slightly steeper for red meat because of the kind of additional health benefits of reducing red meat, and also because of the higher emissions of beef and lamb. So we looked at the levers that are available to government, and then we looked at where will they likely push meat consumption. So some of the reduction in meat consumption will be replaced by whole plant foods such as legumes and pulses. But in our pathways, the majority will be pushed kind of convenience, sort of convenient processed meat and dairy products into kind of plant-based, easy to swap options, because we think that there's quite a bit of opportunity for sort of levers that government can apply. So that means that quite a chunk of the replacement is sort of convenience food by plant-based food. And then we also look at, what's the options for more novel alternative proteins, we call them. So these are sort of plant-based burgers or sausages or mince that are in a way jazzed up with some new technologies such as precision fermentation to make them taste and feel more like the actual meat and dairy product. So we looked at that as well. We think there is an opportunity in the later years if there is investment in those technologies. But like what people think about is cultivated protein. So the kind of really your cultured meat, we kind of think there's because we're quite early on in actually having bulk protein produced through other technologies that might come in the very later years, and obviously that depends on safety, consumer acceptance, things like that. So we're really talking your plant-based burgers, sausages, mince, maybe jazzed up so it tastes a little bit more like the actual meat and dairy products.
Mm-hmm. Obviously there are these kind of big health co-benefits as well, potentially, particularly if we, well, probably through all pathways, to be honest, but also through all different dietary routes, but particularly if we go down the sort of legumes and more veg, sort of a whole food route. That's something we're particularly focused on at the moment. You talked to citizens, which I thought was fantastic as part of the work. Maybe you could just give us a flavour of some of the feedback that you got from them about, were you presenting the sort of pathways to them and getting thoughts on what would be most acceptable, or how did it work?
Yeah, so we did a quite in-depth deliberative process. So we've had 26 people from Birmingham and the surrounding area. And what we did for all sectors, but that includes sort of the dietary changes, we didn't so much debate about, do you think it should be 35% reduction in meat consumption, or should it be less or more? We said this is what we need in our models. Now let's talk about what could make this accessible and affordable for all households. So we really talked more about the policy choices. And what we found, and I guess you get that in quite a lot of research, is that better information is a prerequisite for change. People aren't really clear about the connection between meat and net zero climate change. So there was quite an aha moment for the people who kind of participated in our citizens panel. They sort of acknowledged that, information alone probably won't cut it. Like we all know, we should eat 5 a day. I'm not sure how many people do that necessarily. And then they really wanted things to be they wanted government to step up to make it easy for us to do the thing that is good for the environment and good for our health. So they were really clear they want the double whammy of good for nature, good for the environment, and good for health. So they really wanted support with healthy choices. So I guess there's a big role, even if it's convenience food, citizens want government to support them to be healthy. They were sort of up for, we discussed a little bit what you would maybe call reformulation. So where you take a little bit of meat content out of a, say, processed or ready meal and then replace it with alternative proteins or legumes or something. They thought that would be a very, that would be a feasible, quite quick win for the government, and they would be up for that. There was a little bit of they were unfamiliar and a bit of queasiness around novel alternative proteins. but they still thought because we need to increase that availability of alternatives, the government should invest in that. And then, you know, big point is price. So they really thought that the alternative options like alternative proteins just has to be cheaper.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's something we've been tracking quite carefully in our broken plate report. Well, particularly this year, we looked at dairy alternatives and their relative price compared to cow's milk, essentially, but also tracking the relative price of the different types of plant-based meat, alternative forms of meat. And you know, yeah, you're right, there's quite a journey to go on to actually reduce the relative price of some of those, and obviously even when you're looking at some of the cheaper options like pulses and legumes, you've got other costs around convenience and cooking and so forth, which, as you say, factor in here into the whole picture. But so one of the things that we think is probably quite an important step towards thinking a little bit more about driving up vegetable consumption and pulses and legumes and beans is a horticulture strategy for Britain, where we would actually think about consumption and production in the same breath and think about, well, what are the different levers that we have both to support production and consumption, with procurement, of course, being sort of bang in the middle. And there are a huge number of opportunities, of course, as you'd expect. I was interested to read in the report around horticulture that I might have interpreted this wrong. Let me see if I've understood the points correctly. But that because a lot of horticulture is based on land which has got peat within it, that there's also some benefits to be had from shifting some of that production to indoor production rather than on that land that it's on at the moment. Have I understood that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, certainly a lot of horticultural production is grown on peat, but we were also looking at not just on peatland, but generally what would be the emissions benefit by moving horticulture indoors. That in a world where we see a reduction in livestock numbers, there will be a lot of arable land currently grown for animal feed that could potentially now be used to grow horticultural products on. So definitely, you know, double wins there by taking some of that cropland, sort of those horticultural products off the peat and then growing them on arable land that's currently used to grow animal feed.
And some of the sort of indoor growing, people I think instinctively think, well, isn't that incredibly energy intensive? Is the technology moving in the right direction there?
I mean, there are these vertical indoor systems, but they sort of tend to be based around quite high valued sort of products, such as, I don't know, you know, tomatoes and things like
herbs and lettuce, yeah.
Whereas it's a lot more difficult to try to shift to an indoor system, you know, the sort of potatoes and, you know, the ones that grow sort of below the ground. So that is more difficult. And certainly, you know, you're having to replicate free solar rays by having some sort of LED system. So obviously there'll be additional costs associated with that. So it's not going to benefit all types of croplands by moving them indoors.
Yeah.
And obviously once we decarbonize the grid, you know, the LED systems, you know, there'll be less embedded carbon, and over time they'll reduce in cost. So it's possible that in the future there could be more of that sort of indoor system that can drive as well.
And did you look, because obviously we've got the livestock, so livestock numbers going down, more land potentially for trees for capturing carbon, essentially. We've talked a little bit about the horticulture and the peat space, but what does did you look at what it overall means in terms of levels of food security? Because I know that's one of the concerns that people have, and I mean, it relates to the point that the conversation we had briefly about meat. If we end up just growing less here and importing more, are we just simply outsourcing the problem, essentially? Does the overall sort of net picture of food security look pretty much as is?
Yeah, so we assume that in terms of the percentage of food production or food consumption that's domestically sourced, that stays unchanged.
Right.
So,
Okay.
you know, if we look at what the self-sufficiency ratio, we imagine that that's obviously that's going to stay the same.
Okay.
Any changes in diet, for example, will also see a reduction in imports of those goods. So obviously there will be a shift because you've got less meat production, more arable production. As I said, you've got less cropland being used to grow animal feed, so therefore you could then just be growing more crops for human consumption.
Yeah. That's really clear. Good. Okay. Well, look, we've got a few more minutes just to ask a little bit about what happens next. You've put this out there. The government needs to now turn a version of this into legislation, right? Do you want to just talk us through the process?
I think so. The next stage is really for the government and Parliament to, I guess, to agree to our advice. And so far, to date, they have. So, you know, and then that will go into legislation. Yeah. So we should. I think there's. I can't remember the exact time period, but there'll be a position that the government will have on that.
But it's relatively soon that process all then starts to flow through Parliament, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And presumably, I mean, in that sense, the timing is interesting also because the government has kicked off the process of developing a food strategy, which I think will, I mean, you know, a lot of these issues that we've talked about, I would imagine would be within scope in some form. So hopefully it also that will create a mechanism for some of the policy options that you've proposed to be discussed.
Yes, I think it's an ideal moment to integrate, you know, thinking about net zero is thinking about the food strategy and the land use framework. So really, you know, you've got the three things that need to be in place for government to think holistically about this. Should ideally, you know, it's good timing. So it's really an opportunity for government.
Yeah. Good. Well, thank you both so much. It's been great to have had the chance to talk to you and hear a little bit more about some of the specifics. I didn't explain what your roles were at the start, so I'm going to do that now. Sandra is the lead analyst for people and net zero within the Climate Change Committee. And Indra is the team leader for land, agriculture and nature. You've both been fantastic and what an amazing report. I would definitely recommend people read. You might not have appetite to read the whole thing, but the agriculture chapter's very easy to follow. You've done a brilliant job in making quite a complex picture very digestible. So congratulations for doing that. I know that's not easy. So we'll put the link to the report in the chat. And in the meantime, those of you that are listening, please do share the link with any of your colleagues that you think might be interested to listen back afterwards. We'll obviously make the recording available as normal. And please do sign up for the podcast or for our newsletter to find out more about what we're up to. And so thank you all very much for joining. Thank you, Indra and Sandra, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you for having us.
Thanks. Bye.